specific document that goes through all aspects, right? Evidence collection, prophylaxis provision, like all of it. So I think saying that they'll be trained on local protocols so that there's an awareness and understanding of what happens in this community would be appropriate, because like I said, every community is going to have a protocol. So some of our smaller communities, like when you think about like the Sacramento area, right? There's a lot of little tiny towns like all surrounding that area. There's a protocol that encompasses a lot of them together, right? But every single individual one has a protocol for what they do if an allegation comes in. Does that make sense?
It does to me.
Meredith, does that make sense to you?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
So looking back at all facility staff shall be trained on local. Sorry if I wasn't paying attention when that got typed. Do we need just on local protocols for the response to sexual assault period, or is it important to have in the community?
No, I think in response to sexual assault, I think that's fine.
Perfect.
Yeah. Okay, what does everyone else think? Good?
Yeah, the only question I had was, do we need the specific language related to sexual assault response team? Or
no, because it says in that second paragraph there, the evidentiary examination and initial treatment of victims sexual assault shall be conducted at a health facility that is separate from the custodial facility and is properly equipped and staffed with personnel trained and experienced in such procedures. So I think that's enough. Because like I said, sometimes it's embedded in local hospitals and sometimes it's standalone teams. So I think saying that they'll be trained on the local protocols so that, you know, there's awareness.
Yeah, I gotcha. I gotcha. We utilize the CAC and some other things that are local here, and it just made me think that I didn't see any of the probation staff on our MDT. Got law enforcement and the district attorneys and all kind of other people. So
you know, there's not probation. It's interesting, and I'll just digress for a minute. There's you know, like different family justice centers. Probation isn't present on site at the family justice centers either, because family justice centers are specific to victim services, right? And probation works more with the offenders. And so it's an interesting observation from where we sit, right?
Yeah, interesting. No, the language is good, and I appreciate the clarification on what was contained in the previous paragraph.
Was there anything else that we should talk about or call out here? Can we move on to 1454?
Just to jump in, Kristen, my recommendation will be, I'm going to be hopeful that we can get through 1454 and then take a quick break. And before we go into break, I just want to make a statement about the next section of regulations. Does that sound good to you?
Sure.
Thank you. 1454.
So it looks like there wasn't any specific changes noted here. And I don't see any public comment or SYTF subcommittee recommendations. Does anybody here have anything specific about this section? No? Okay. Oh my goodness, have we included the 1400s? Wow. Okay, so Allison, you are on.
So I don't want to talk too long about this. So these next sections, we call them crossover regulations. So other work groups and the executive steering committee have looked at suicide prevention plan, death and serious illness or injury, and a couple of other regulations that have reference to healthcare procedures and policies. So I just wanted to set up our next piece of discussion. So when we go through these, what I'd like to do is just go over what other work groups or the ESC has talked about and see where there's any recommendations from this group as well. I just wanted to, this has been reviewed by other work groups. So I just wanted to call that out. Then let's take a break, make sure everybody can get a chance to stretch their legs. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, how long is our break?
How about, we didn't get a break earlier, so why don't we do 15 minutes?
Okay, sounds good.
Okay, hopefully everybody got a chance to stretch their legs and take some breaths and either cool off or warm up depending on your climate.
Well, I think it depends if you're inside or outside here.
Exactly, I know. It is so chilly in here.
Yep.
And outside well, it says 97, but it feels like 50 because I'm so cold, but
Yeah.
it's all
Yeah.
good. It's all good. So let's jump into our next section. So again, as I mentioned, these next regulations have been reviewed by the ESC or another work group. And what we're asking here is that the expertise in this work group confirm any of the recommended revisions or make any updates based on subject matter expertise. So jumping in with 1329 suicide prevention plan, this regulation was really heavily revised in the last cycle. It used to live in I get my articles messed up. In Article 8 in Health Services, but we pulled it out a few cycles ago to make sure that it crosses over very clearly from healthcare into probation and detention staff. It's also very heavily modeled on, oh my heavens, Lindsay Hayes's model. Oof, I forgot his name for a moment. Lindsay Hayes, right? His model for suicide prevention in detention facilities. So the changes that were made by the executive steering committee was to include in F communication that in intake, if it's not the arresting officer, that it's the transporting officer, and adding persons standing in loco parentis to make sure that when a young person is coming into the facility, that there's really clear communication about from anybody that's had contact with that young person, particularly the person transporting them to the facility, that there's communication about any suicide risk. And that's all I'll say about that. If anybody has any other suggestions.
So I guess I just have a question. Who, in the intake process, who is that communication between with the transporting officer and the family or guardians? Like, who's talking to them? The intake staff at the facility?
Yes. So again, I'm reading back up where it says, you have to have this plan. The plan shall include the following elements. So the intake, so I think to probably clarify that, where it says the intake process shall include communication with, I mean, you could easily fix that by saying the intake process shall include communication between intake staff, between facility intake staff and the arresting officer, transportation officer. Does that help? That's a good question, actually.
So does that then mean that the facility intake staff are reaching out to all of these people at the point of intake, like when they're doing the intake?
Ooh, more good questions. Well, the transporting an arresting officer person is easy. And my second piece about speaking with the family, that might not happen right away, but my question back to you, Kristen and Amanda, how and when do you reach out to the family to see if there's any risk of suicidal behavior or ideation? Because that's a good question. I'm making a huge assumption that at some point it happens and the plan includes it, but it might even reach back out to some of those healthcare procedures we talked about earlier.
Well, behavioral health will do it later in the process, as part of the comprehensive psychosocial assessment. at intake, I know the intake facility won't, if they're actively suicidal, the intake will not accept them without mental health clearance, i.e. that assessment by the crisis to see if they need inpatient hospitalization. But if they're medically cleared, medically and psychiatrically cleared, then they're safe to be admitted to the facility. I know that detention staff notify the parents that they were booked into the facility. I don't know what questions that they ask, or if the parents at that point can certainly share any concerns that they have with the staff. But our process wouldn't come along until later, where we would reach out to the parents to gather more psychosocial information.
And that would be appropriate, like if the plan said, you know, during whatever next step, family, guardians, person standing local parentis are contacted to determine if there's any risk of suicidal ideation or behaviors. Does that help answer the question, Kristen?
Yep. So is that the only recommended change?
Yes.
Right, does anyone have anything else? No?
Allison, just to clarify, so what we're looking at is the entirety of what like was discussed by the ESC.
Yes. Well, you're looking at the recommendations that the ESC made after discussion. That was the one revision that the group made. It doesn't encompass the totality of the discussion, just the final revision that was made.
Part of the reason that I'm asking is because I recall the discussion talking in part about timelines and timeliness, when there were notations, for example, in the Kings County inspection report, where they were leaving youth in the observation room at intake, sometimes up to 24 hours or more, because of the slow response time, and the need to have a mental health clinician meet with them before they could be moved out of this observation room.
Yeah, so again, scratching back into my brain, they were found out of compliance with that piece of it way back when, Kings County in particular. And what I'm looking at is kind of crosses so many issues there. The fact that, you know, because it crosses into room confinement, you can't put a young person in room confinement because they exhibit suicidal behavior unless the agency has attempted less restrictive. And I don't want to talk about one particular county. If a young person's going to go into room confinement, the agency has to attempt and be unsuccessful on those less restrictive settings. So I recall the conversation. I'm gonna be honest with you, not in granular detail. So I'll ask, like, do you have a place where you would recommend something about timeliness or a reaction that's more timely?
Partly, thinking about the timelines we've just put into some of the mental health screening and then evaluation and assessment, and trying to figure out how to put these things, so that they're aligned and not in conflict. I will say that the Kings County report I looked at found compliance. So that is where I have concerns about the standard, because it documented both compliance and concerns about holding youth in these inappropriate settings for long periods. I'm wondering, Amanda, if there are, I don't know, the way your facility might do it in terms of, do you all have an expectation on timing? What I don't see is a distinction between like at risk of suicide and like actively suicidal. And so like, I imagine that the responses are different, or maybe I'm missing that has that nuance.
If I could
So,
speak on it.
go ahead,
just real quick.
Forrest.
Just looking at this may address a piece of what you may be inferring, on the back page there. The very last sentence of, that paragraph where it says any deprivation of programs, services, or activities for youth at risk of suicide shall be documented and approved by the facility manager. Some of that might include some of the timelines. I do typically, I agree it should be approved by the facility manager. It wouldn't hurt to also have something that says in conjunction with behavioral health, because if you're gonna I hate to use the word deprive, but if you're gonna go on with the regulation, if you're gonna deprive anyone of any programs because of suicide ideations, you would think as a facility manager, you would include behavioral health as part of that assessment. And if I'm doing an inspection and I'm looking at, as you said, Meredith, with, the timelines, I am looking to see, for what reason and when, for these programs, like how was this decision made and who made the decision, and that kind of captures it in that last paragraph. So I don't know if that's answering enough or if it's too vague, but that kind of it touches a little bit on some timelines there with accountability.
I like that. I think that does address part of what I'm raising. I agree that I can see why it was pulled out of Article 8, and also want to make sure that behavioral health providers are appropriately included and not left out of this now that it's in a different article. I guess I'm, in addition to what you described for us, which I thought sounded great, I'm looking at like B3 and B4. So, you identify during screening a risk of suicide and implement precautionary protocols pending this assessment. And so I just worry that like precautionary protocols becomes like, intense observation or isolation that could end up being prolonged if this assessment, for example, takes 7 days now that we've written that in. So that's part of the issue that I'm trying to raise.
Is there a way, feel like I was just talking about this, is I hear what you're saying. There's a lot of crossover to be made. The room confinement law and regulation came in after this regulation was heavily edited. Precautionary protocol shall be developed to ensure the youth's safety pending the behavioral mental health assessment. I mean, you could make a general statement that room confinement shall not be used as a protocol unless I mean, you could, you don't want to repeat a regulation unless, you know, less restrictive alternatives have been attempted and are unsuccessful, and the youth is you know, a safety and security risk to themselves. I mean, the safety room is an option for protection. The kid can't be closed in that room. Because of the requirements of room confinement and because of the direct visual observation nature. So I don't know if that's I think if I could distill what shouldn't happen and what you're bringing up as an issue is that a young person shouldn't be isolated because they're exhibiting suicidal behavior, which shouldn't happen, but maybe making a reference like this is helpful to avoid that. Again, you know, no regulation is going to prevent somebody from doing something inappropriate, but if there's another requirement to be called out, maybe that would help. We went around and around, you know, you brought up intense observation. Section D, the procedures for monitoring of youth identified at risk for suicide. We went around and around and around on that one because some agencies will say, oh, one-on-one, we're doing a one-on-one. A lot of places don't have the ability to do, you know, one-on-one close observation. So they'll do, you know, 5-minute or 10-minute checks, you know, to get more checks on young people so they're not going up to 15 minutes. I'll just pause there because I don't know if that addresses the exact concern you have, which is a concern of mine. They shouldn't be put in a room because they're exhibiting those behaviors.
Well, and I think I might argue that that's counter to kind of what is in the best interest of the kid in most cases, right? You want to have them up and participating as much as possible. And I would point out too that precautionary protocols could include, you know, not having certain things in their room and not necessarily pointing just at isolation or room confinement, right?
Because to me, youth identified at risk for suicide, at risk is a very, very broad term. And it doesn't indicate that then there's any elevated or immediate risk. A lot of people live with chronic suicidal ideations and they really have no intent, plan, or means. So there's that. And so somebody being at risk for suicide, I agree, should not be denied opportunity to participate. And what Kristen is saying, often we put in what we refer to as special instructions. Whereas we might, as my earlier comment, restrict somebody from having a razor. Certain other laundry loops. Don't know why they exist other than to tie your laundry together so it comes back to you. But those are one of the first things that we remove from people who may be concerned we may be concerned about suicide. So there is those graduated intervention responses. And were we actually talking originally about any sort of timelines and communication notifications to families? Or did we just move on to what was determined to be what the staff should do to avoid excessive room confinements or isolation?
I think it's the latter. What I'm talking about is, I guess let me ask you, so I agree with you, this concept of risk seems very, like, a lot of youth could fall into that and not have an urgent, active concern. So, I'm going back now to our mental health services tiers. We sort of went through their screening. So I'm assuming this is identified at screening, which happens at intake. And I guess my question would be to you. I think we gave it what did we call it? I wish I had copied it down. A mental status evaluation. Within 7 days, right? For everybody. But if the screening, what did we say? If there's an emergency issue, it happens within 24 hours. And I'm wondering, like, someone who's identified to be at risk, would that fall in that 24-hour in your assessment? And I don't know if you can put back that to Amanda, like that section, so we can recall.
I think because suicidality is so dynamic, it's not we screen one time and then it's
right.
Then it's over. Yes, suicide is one of the screening points within the screening tools, the standardized screening tools. So there's one opportunity there. If the youth or the medical staff or the judge, anybody, the detention staff have any concerns at any particular point about someone's risk for suicide, if they've made any parasuicidal gestures or any kind of thing like that, then we're notified, and then we go do that mental status exam, safety check, are you okay, and create safety plans with youth if needed, and again restrict access to in the least restrictive environment before we get to any sort of safety room placements. There's a lot of opportunities to do that, so it's not a one and done.
Right.
It's an ongoing needs-based dynamic circumstance.
I think that makes sense, and it does seem like it's addressed to some extent in the lower down pieces, but specifically here where we're talking about intake. So aside from like this is, I guess, not one and done, but number one, likely it's like the first spot, the first place of the screening. And it talks about protocols pending assessment. And so what I'm saying is we have no timeline for the assessment and no limits on the protocols. I would not favor restating the room confinement standard here because I don't see that as being any different than the regulation. If we wanted to make it even a heightened standard to not use room confinement, like Kristen said, that would actually be like contrary to a health response to this risk. I would favor that. What I'm trying to get us to just hone in on is that we have here a screening process and that a youth could sit and wait for health assessment because of the potential length of time that the health assessment could take under these protocols that might be excessively cautious.
So in number 3, all youth have been identified during the intake screening process to be at risk of suicide shall be referred to the behavioral mental health staff for a suicide risk assessment. And what's an appropriate amount of time, do we think? If that's the problem here, that we're worried about young people languishing before they have that assessment, that next step. Maybe we can kind of think about what a appropriate amount of time is within the next day, 24 hours. How do we align it with some of the other discussions? Because that, like, if it were 24 hours, and again, I'm just throwing that out there, because that would sort of address the issue. I mean, each agency is going to have to come up with those precautionary protocols based on the young person, their inherent risk. What's the behavior? So if, does adding something to number 3 address that issue, that languishing? Kristen, Amanda, what's a reasonable amount of time?
Well, to me, reasonable would be as soon as possible, but I know that's not specific enough.
I love it. Put it in there. Just kidding. Within as soon as possible, but no later than. Is there a like a happy medium there? As soon as possible. And I hear what you're saying. I mean, we always have to think about, especially some of our more rural, less resourced areas that don't have staff on site, as soon as possible, but no later than 24 hours after the identification of risk or something like
Well-
that. Meredith, I don't know if that aligns with, or if that helps address your concern and timely.
Well, if we go back to kind of the timelines for evaluation and assessment that we talked about earlier, to me, those timelines are built into this, because what
Okay.
we're talking about is youth who have been identified during this intake screening.
Mhm.
So it doesn't
Right.
mean that they're at imminent risk.
Right. That's a
So
good point.
if they've been identified, that puts them in that high category. So that's going to kind of make those timelines
So it's dependent on risk, right?
It is
this,
dependent upon
Yeah.
risk at intake, because you also have same protocols for the different touch points where youth become despondent, right? After court,
Mhm.
different events in the community, bad visits with family,
Mhm.
etc., that then heighten and elevate the risk.
Right.
So, if anything, I would think that that somewhere of that most immediate, as Kristen said, as soon as possible. So if somebody they're making suicidal gestures, they're making suicidal statements, we're going to want to get out there as soon as possible. And really with that either is right now or, within the next 15 minutes. I mean, it's such a dynamic, response. So where do we put that? Where do we capture that ever changing mental status of a youth?
Well, I think in that scenario, they're going to be referred as soon as possible. And then the next statement, number 4, precautionary protocol shall be developed to ensure the youth safety pending the behavioral mental health assessment. I think we could include a piece there that speaks to if the youth's behavior continues to escalate beyond, what can be managed in the facility, they go for a 5150 evaluation either at the crisis stabilization unit or the emergency department.
And I think that there's a good place for those protocols, because part of what we're talking about is precautionary protocols. So it's
Right.
not going to just happen at intake, but how do we going to address those very urgent, very immediate needs, again, before, during, or after the mental health assessment?
Right. I mean, Like in our facility, the unit staff are going to rely on mental health staff when they're on site to guide them and help them figure out what those protocols should be. But there should be something in here that allows for the probation staff to make the determination that the protocols that they have access to, by way of precaution to keep the kids safe until mental health can weigh in, shouldn't limit them to keeping the kid here. If they can't keep them safe, they gotta go and get a higher level of care.
Or at least evaluated, assessed by the
Evaluated for that, right?
for that need.
Right.
Because oftentimes time and distance from
Mhm.
the feelings, the thoughts and feelings that create the suicidal state, are mitigated with, again, time and attention, somebody to listen. So, I would suggest, that language that, Kristen just kind of mentioned, should in number 4, should there be an urgent, immediate need?
Yeah, an escalation of the behavior.
Could we make that number 5 as like a standalone? That doesn't sound like a precautionary protocol, but rather a response to further escalation.
Yeah, I think if you wanted to put it in number 5, you could say, if the youth's behavior continues to escalate, and safety measures become more of a concern or something to that effect, the youth will be taken to either a crisis stabilization unit or an emergency department for further evaluation, suicide risk. Taken to a crisis stabilization unit. Or emergency department for further assessment of suicide risk.
I mean, if I could say something here. So I know I think Allison may have spoke on some, as far as we don't want to write the policy for the facility. Because I do observe that the precautionary protocols, a lot of times in policy, following number 4, the facility will state all of the protocols, and they will just, they will say, suicide, level watch level 1 and suicide watch level 2. And if you go to this next level, then you would call the next protocol would be to call, the crisis line. So hotline. So in terms of just adding numbers and being too prescriptive, just giving the facility a little room to write their policy and spell it out themselves. I don't know if we want to leave it general, or if that's what you want to do, make it more specific.
Well, I think that's a good piece of information, because again, their precautionary protocols are going to take that should take that escalation and graduation into, because it'll, it can be that fast. So the facility is going to have to kind of run through their decision trees based on their protocols, that could lead straight to even bypassing a safety room placement, to get mental health staff on to here to determine if a safety plan can even be generated. I've seen instances where the detention facility has just went straight to taking someone to the emergency department for a mental health evaluation, and BHS has been on site. But it has been determined, because of either of the circumstance required that immediacy and that level of intervention. And I've seen other instances not. So I guess it doesn't really matter to me one way or the other if we do feel like we need to spell it out. If in an escalation, send them to crisis right away. But it sounds like Forrest is saying that facilities pretty much have that baked in the cake already. Is that true, Forrest? Did I?
Yeah, typically, as I was actually reading part of me was gonna suggest putting precautionary watch protocols, but just trying not to spell it out too much, but yes, typically when you read the suicide prevention plan, it'll go to precautionary protocols and then it will begin to list the different suicide, the gradual, watch level 1, watch level 2. And when you get to this point, or if no behavioral health are, available, to call a crisis line. One thing that I think it might have been something that Meredith was addressing with number 4. At the end of number 4, it could be something: precautionary protocols shall be developed to ensure the youth safety pending behavioral health, mental health assessment, and to limit a use, something to the effect and limit a youth time in isolation or something. If you're looking at, timelines, it sounds like you kind of wanted something to be able to pinpoint, kind of address the timeline and provide some accountability of, getting the kid, ensuring that the youth is out of his or her room.
Yes, exactly. That was, I was brainstorming language similar to that for us, something like, I don't know if folks would agree, something like, isolation of youth should be avoided as much as possible, and in all cases comply with, and then list the safety room and room confinement statutes, or sorry, sections, so that it's very clear that just because there's a suicide risk identified does not sweep those other sections out of the way.
So after number 4, youth shall not be isolation of youth shall be avoided. I would take out as much as possible. Isolation of youth shall be avoided. And so isolation does not always equal, I mean, we have to be clear. If it's room confinement, it's room confinement. I know it gets into semantics here, but I mean, you could put a young person in the corner of a room. That could feel isolating to that young person as well. So if you want to keep it really broad, isolation of youth shall be avoided. And if isolation results in room confinement, the requirements of section 1354.5 shall apply. Does that help? It also kind of addresses the fact that a kid can't be, again, that could be isolating. Sit in the corner and I'm going to sit in front of you and you can just stare at the wall for 4 hours. That could be pretty rough for a young person as well. So it kind of addresses both of those instances. Is that where you would put that, Meredith?
I think that works. I don't know where we left as an ESC the separation section. So
yeah,
that might be towards.
There's a little bit of work to be done on that section as well, because I don't want to get into there's a lot that needs to be tweaked with respect to room confinement and separation.
Okay.
But I think in this, I mean, you go back to, again, the whole intent of this regulation was to mirror, not mirror, to shadow Lindsay Hayes's requirements and let the agency come up with what their policy is. And again, to Amanda's point, risk is very different from one facility to the next. So the agency needs to figure out what that risk is and then deal with it. So I like putting isolation in there because I think that's a really strong tenet of preserving the youth's, mental health, even if they are appearing to be at risk for suicide. So I like it. I mean, I wrote it, so of course I like it, but I think it addresses some of those issues. Did we do it?
Maybe.
Maybe. And I just want to do a quick time check. It's 3:21. I was so hoping, leaves us with about 10 more regulations after 1341. There aren't a lot. I don't want to discount there not being public comment, but right now we have 7 attendees. Even if everybody did public comment, that would be 14 minutes. So maybe we can keep going until 3:45 and then open it up for public comment.
Yeah.
If that feels comfortable. And
so.
if we feel good about 1329, we can go to 1341.
Let's do it.
Okay, so the executive steering committee did have some discussion and then just making sure that there's notifications. Also, the SYTF subcommittee had some recommendations about notification. We talked about this earlier. This is very specific to if a young person dies within a facility, grief resources being available for other youth. And then again, making sure that there's notification to parents and other appropriate parties if a young person is seriously injured or is ill. So any discussion related to that, please? Are we good? Okay. Section 1350 is admittance procedures. And again, a couple of things. This was some recommendations by the ESC. Again, documenting what's offered in the admittance process. That's always done in practice, but it was a good addition to make sure that it's something that BSCC can inspect for. Offer of food upon arrival, considering a youth's dietary restrictions. And then contact with the youth social worker if they are also a dependent under WIC 300. So again, this is the admittance process. Policies need to be trauma informed, culturally relevant, and responsive to the youth's language and literacy needs. Any discussion? Meredith, I'm sorry if I didn't see your.
No, I just put it up.
There.
I like all of the proposed changes. I recalled a discussion with Director Lucero around 1850 or 1350B. So I thought we had discussed staff coming back with suggestions for having this be something that's has a bit more continual over time sort of consideration around the least restrictive environment. But I'm not seeing anything on that point. I don't know. If you
Yeah, and
recall that.
there might be some crisscross there. Staff is, we're doing a lot of updating, so it's very possible that we just haven't filled that section out yet. I remember the discussion as well. So that recommendation would still stand. I remember the conversation again. I don't know if you want to discuss it again or just leave it. I promise you that it won't be forgotten. It just hasn't been included here.
Thank you. That's good. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. Any others? So then 1351 release procedures. Again, this is just relating to notification, person standing in local parentis and adding spouse, because sometimes young people, especially could be people in SYTFs, their spouse could be notified. I think we added that to the other regulations as well. And again, this is the notifications for when a person is released. And if people notice the deletion of language related to reentry services, that was added to another regulation. It wasn't just wholeheartedly ripped out of there. There was some serious consideration and discussion around reentry services. It's just not in this regulation. Moving on to 1352.5.
Just really quick, sorry,
sure.
Allison, I would just say, I don't know exactly if we settled on how to sort of just cross-reference the new CalAIM requirements, but I believe we thought they should at least be acknowledged, so I don't know if that also needs to be acknowledged here. Or if it's
Yeah,
enough.
and we have that as a staff recommendation
Okay.
too. I mean, we really need to go through and figure out where and how CalAIM applies. And so we'll be doing that sort of as an overlay, and then hopefully we'll have, not hopefully, we'll have that ready for ESC discussion.
Yeah, CalAIM is so big and has so many.
Oh, yeah.
I was in a meeting yesterday. I was like, okay, I understand this moment. What
Yeah,
happened?
it's huge. I don't even think it's done, if I understand properly.
No, there's more.
So 1352.5 transgender, non-binary and intersex youth. And we do have a subject matter expert on our executive steering committee that helped us with some of this language, adding the term non-binary, which we're also going to be adding to our definitions, making sure that young people have access to very specifically gender affirming care and treatment. And then again, updating updating it and adding the term non-binary to the regulation, but there was no other revisions other than these by the SYTF or the ESC. I'm going to take a giant deep breath on room confinement. We as staff are still in the middle of teasing out what the final room confinement regulation will look like. So let me make an attempt to go over what's going to be recommended, and maybe what we could talk about are concepts that are missing from the medical mental health perspective. So the current regulation for room confinement just plunks the Welfare and Institutions Code into regulation, which doesn't help operationally all the time. Most importantly, there's been a lot of confusion around what's required institutional operations. So there will be a definition added to Title 15 that defines what required institutional operations are and when, what doesn't count as room confinement, things like, hygiene, shift change, things like that. Very, very clear guidance to agencies that you can't say that everybody's tired. That's a required institutional operation. So we're going to lock everybody in their rooms for an hour. And then there was a statute change that requires that. I think this is a statute change. Sorry if my brain just exploded on me. That the maximum, they need to be reasonable and they can't exceed 2 hours. Like you can't say, oh, shift change takes 2 hours. So everybody has to sit in their room for required institutional operation. So that's the first recommendation. And then this is really important. There was no requirement for documentation in the original regulation. So again, requiring documentation and noting the reasons, the date, time, placement, and the date and time and removal from room confinement. And this helps not only helps agencies make sure that they meet the very specific timeframes in the regulation and the statute, but also gives BSCC something to look at. Every single agency documents it in some way, shape, or form, but it will be incredibly important that agencies have that very clear in their policy and procedure. Under 3, what we were talking about, room confinement shall not be used as an intervention for youth identified as intervention for youth identified as at risk for suicide, which is really important. And again, this is a requirement that was added in statute. We provided reasonable access to toilets at all hours, including during normal sleeping hours. The next section, a youth may be held up to 4 hours in room confinement. This next statement is really important. Making sure that people don't think, oh, I have 4 hours to put them in room confinement. Youth shall be removed from room confinement as soon as practicable while considering the safety and security of the youth, staff, and other youth in the facility. So those are the biggest. There's some pretty substantive changes. We've had some discussions amongst ourselves as staff, so we're probably going to tinker with it a little bit more. Again, we have to be really careful to keep, we can't go under what the statute says. So throw that out there. I tried to do that really quickly, so hopefully it made sense, but you all see it in front of you, and you might see some other changes as it makes its way to the ESC. So if anybody has any concepts or thoughts to add, love to hear them. Or you think we're on such a good track and we keep going with it. Meredith?
I think you're on such a good track.
Yay!
Keep going
All
with
right,
it.
end the meeting right now. She said it. No, just kidding.
I do have, well, one that's a question around one of the things that you're addressing. If you wouldn't mind scrolling up to A1 and maybe just across the board. Is it the expectation that these limits are within a 24-hour period, the time limit specifically? In other words, could it, institutional operations, is that 2 hours every day? Or is that 2 hours, let you out 5 minutes, 2 hours back? Like how does this time limit operate?
That's a good question. The intent was that if youth need to go to their rooms, and it does happen throughout the day, like coming back from school, that one instance cannot exceed 2 hours. It doesn't place a limit on how frequently. Now I know I want to pretend I know what you're thinking. Well, gee whiz, every 5 minutes, could they do a 2-hour required institutional operation? The answer is no. Again, the agency has to define for themselves what's required institutional operations. I don't have the definition. Hold on, I do. Stand by. I have it in front of me. Required institutional operations means those times when staff may need to place youth in a locked room to accomplish regular facility operations that ensure the safety and security of youth and staff, including shift change. Now I'm paraphrasing. Oh, there it is. shift change, shift briefing, transition time, hygiene immediately following an incident. I mean, these are reasonable times where it makes sense. And believe me, we've seen reasonable and we've seen unreasonable. And it's really hard to regulate reasonable. But the bottom line is there are going to be times during the day when the youth need to return to their rooms and something else needs to happen. Most facilities, it's 5-10 minutes. We're doing shift change. We need to keep everybody safe while there's, transition times. But this defines it. There was no definition in the past, and now the facility can do it for no longer than 2 hours.
Okay, that's helpful. My second question or concern is I think what we just did in the suicide prevention may be in conflict with what you've got here under B3 now.
Okay. And I was, again, my memory was failing me. I knew we had done something with it. So
This appears to prohibit.
yeah, no, I'm with you on that
Okay.
one. So I think my recommendation would probably be to eliminate that section about room confinement and leave the isolation shall be avoided. Or maybe separation, we could call it separation. And then when we figure out what the end result of 1354 looks like, we can update. I don't know if you want to I don't know if it's a pain in the rump, Amanda F, to go back to 1329 rather than saying it complies with.
I would favor
Right.
stating, like having them mirror each other so that
How
room
about,
confinement shall
Yeah.
not be used.
how about this? How about separation of youth shall be avoided? Leave it consistent with the other regulation. Separation of youth shall be avoided, comma, and consistent with section 1354.5, room confinement shall not be used as an intervention for youth at risk for suicide, period. And then delete the rest. How does that sound?
That looks good to me.
Thank you, Amanda F. Any other questions or comments or concerns, Meredith?
I did have a question about the single person rooms. That's now D.
Yes.
I'm struggling with what the intent of this is.
So that's
because-
straight from the statute. Sorry, I don't mean to do an evil laugh
No, I
because
get it.
I probably wouldn't have put that in there had I written both. Because I think what the fear was is that when they were writing the law, somebody realized that, oh, kids are going to be sleeping by themselves.
Right.
In their rooms. Is that room confinement? And it would have been so much easier to say, does not apply to sleeping hours,
Right. Well,
So-
I do think actually the grammar here is a little different than the statute, and I think it's changing the meaning.
Oh, that's okay. I would need to double check on that. I didn't think we changed it, but I believe you.
It's mostly where the exception falls. So I think that what the first clause of the sentence is this section is not intended to limit the use of single person rooms for the housing of minors.
Mhm.
So that's like you can use single person rooms, and does not apply to normal sleeping hours. What they did is it in the statute says, and except as provided in subdivision F, does not apply to normal sleeping hours. So I'm not exactly sure. The subdivision F is different in the statute. It looks like a mess to me now, but the grammar is a little different.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, and I think this is where, when I was saying like, we really need to sit down with the statute and the revisions and make some sense out of it. This is not fully cooked at
Okay.
all, 100%. And we're also going to rely heavily on our council to help us make sure that we're properly aligning with the requirements in statute. Because I agree, it's clunky. And as there's been some legislative changes and we change this regulation, we don't want to mess with the intent.
Thank you.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not giving you any language here, but the assurance that we're going to address it, and then obviously it will be seen again. Yeah, it's all over the place. Other questions? In 3 minutes, we're going to talk about use of force and use of restraints. What you'll see here, and again, I want to wrap up in about 3 minutes so we can see if we have any public comment, and then we can talk about what to do next. So what the ESC did take many runs at this regulation, and basically has 2 regulations to propose to the board. One is expanding the requirements for agencies that would use chemical agents. And then the second version that was proposed by the ESC eliminates the use of chemical agents entirely from the regulation. So the revisions look the same. The second version, again, both versions will be going to the ESC. Most likely both versions will go to our board. So it really is what this subcommittee recommends in terms of one they feel more strongly about, or if they have any other revisions to the regulation. Probably not the best one to try to end on. So I'm also happy to talk about next steps. Maybe we could even have an hour-long meeting to wrap it up. But so I'm asking like 4 questions. What do y'all think? What do you recommend, and what do you want to do next?
So I guess I have a question first, just as a point of clarification, Allison.
Yes.
So 2 rewritten sections for use of force. The one that just says use of force is a revision of the current standard. And then there's a second one that would eliminate the use of chemical agents in the facility. So the second one, would it be up to the board to decide which one gets adopted?
So that's a great question. Again, the ESC will at some point likely vote on one or the other.
Okay.
And it could happen that the ESC comes to consensus and passes one or the other ahead, or the ESC could choose to say, hey, we are not able to come to consensus. And we, the ESC, would like the board to weigh in on and ultimately vote on which one moves forward.
Got it.
Yeah. This is a really, very, very important topic that has really strong really strong, opinion on both sides, and this is where we're at right now. And I don't know, like I said, if this group has there's three of you, today. I don't know, again, this is going to go to the ESC either way, so I don't know if you want to take a look at, and again, we're gonna have to do this in another time, take a look at what's in there and also make a judgment, make a call and say, you know, this, we agree that this should move forward without chemical agents or with, or you could say the ESC should consider putting both of these forth to the board.
So do you want, perhaps Allison, given the time, that maybe we put that out to the larger group, to others that aren't here, to have an opinion about that and do it via email? Or do we want to come back together to talk about this and the remaining? Because how many other sections are there that we haven't gotten to?
One more and some
Just one more.
definitions.
So this
Yeah,
one and
so
one more.
my recommendation would be if we could find an amenable time and set, I mean, we could really, everybody has this regulation, so the instructions could be to the group saying that we are gonna have an hour and a half to talk about use of force and use of restraint devices and safety room procedures. Please review the revisions that have been proposed by the Executive Steering Committee, and we'll have an hour and a half to get through those,
Okay.
which seems much more reasonable than 6 hours.
Yeah, no, I would support that.
Do we have, I see heads nodding. So I'm gonna
Yes.
give, you know, it's unfortunate that not everybody was able to appear today. We did hear from Dr. Arguello that he was unable to attend. Thankfully, he was able to send some of his recommendations. So what I would appreciate, Kristen, is a couple days and hour and a half time slots, and we'll send that out to the group, and we'll go with the critical mass, and hopefully we could do that in the next few weeks if we can have a shorter time frame. And we'll send out pretty specific instructions to the group to say review 1357, 58, 59, and we'll wrap those up.
Okay.
So at this point, we'll turn it over, and then we'll wrap up after public comment, but I'll look over to our participants. And much like we did earlier, there's nobody in the room, so we will rely on Zoom to do public comment. Please raise your hand or dial *6 if you'd like to make a comment. Our colleague Howie will add you to the queue, call you when it's your turn, and we will have a 2-minute timer for you to make comment. And again, I didn't say this earlier, I apologize, but people can also submit any comments to our regulations@bscc.ca.gov account. So looking for any public commenters?
We currently have no raised hands.
Thank you, Howie. So Howie, just give a shout out. I mean, we'll wrap up here. If anybody changes their mind in the next few minutes and wants to jump in, we'll certainly provide people with that opportunity, but hearing no hands up, seeing no hands up, we will endeavor to wrap up. Really appreciate you, Kristen and Amanda and Meredith, for working through these. We got a lot of really good work done, and I'm really hopeful, and with some focused time, we can get the rest of these taken care of. And then that gets us closer to scheduling the Executive Steering Committee, which just makes me feel so delightful, to use an overused word. So I'll throw it over to Kristen for any parting comments, or Amanda, Meredith, any parting comments since we're here?
we got through the
We got-
sections that we wanted to. So yeah, I
Yeah.
think coming back to that, we accomplished a lot. We've been doing this for a while, so I appreciate
we-
everybody,
yeah.
and I always learn so much from all of you and help to change my perspective on the work that we do and how we implement the services and supports in the facility. So thank you.
Thank you.
Just echo the thanks, and especially Amanda F. jumping us
Amanda
around and getting
F.
those edits in, and Forrest, thank you for all of the context. And Kristen and Amanda, it's great to learn from you. Thank you for the collaboration. And of course, Allison for leading us through.
And my cheery disposition.
Your delightful disposition.
I'm delightful. Thank you.
Yeah, I echo all of that. We got through a lot today. And it just kind of flew by, right? So here we are, almost 4 o'clock, and we're done for the most part. I appreciate the collegiality and the conversation and just kind of, the brainstorming that we've done. So I will send you some dates, Allison, coming up. I'm going to be out of the office for a few weeks coming up, but after that, towards the end of July and August, I will have some time. So
Perfect. Perfect. Thank you all so much. We always learn a lot, and this has been, we've spent a lot of time together. So I really appreciate that we're smiling at the end. Thank you so much. And everybody have a wonderful, I believe it's Tuesday, have a wonderful Tuesday and the rest of your week.
all right. See you
All right.
later.
Thank you. Thank you, Kristen.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye, everybody.